should meditate within the core of his heart upon the laughter of Lord Vishnu. The laughter of Vishnu is so captivating that it can be easily meditated upon. When the Supreme Lord is laughing, one can see his small teeth, which resemble jasmine buds rendered rosy by the splendor of his lips. Once devoting his mind to this, the yogi should no longer desire to see anything else. Wow, a nice verse. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Prabhupada writes, it is recommended that the yogi visualize the laugh of the Lord after studying his smile very carefully. These particular descriptions of meditation on the smile, laughter, face, lips, and teeth all indicate conclusively that God is not impersonal. It is described herein that one should meditate on the laughter or smiling of Vishnu. There is no other activity that can completely cleanse the heart of the devotee. The exceptional beauty of the laughter of Lord Vishnu is that when he smiles, his small teeth, which resemble the buds of jasmine flowers, at once become reddish, reflecting his rosy lips. If the yogi is able to place the beautiful face of the Lord in the core of his heart, he will be completely satisfied. In all other words, when one is absorbed in seeing the beauty of the Lord within himself, the material attraction can no longer disturb him. Very nice verse. Okay, verse 34. By following this course, the yogi gradually develops pure love for the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Hari. In the course of his progress in devotional service, the hairs on his body stand erect through excessive joy, and he is constantly bathed in a stream of tears occasioned by intense love. Gradually, even the mind, which is used as a means to attract the Lord, as one attracts a fish to a hook, withdraws from material activity. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. By following this course, here it is clearly mentioned that meditation, which is an action of the mind, is not the perfect stage of samadhi or absorption. In the beginning, the mind is employed in attracting the form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But in higher stages, there's no question of using the mind. A devotee becomes accustomed to serving the Supreme Lord by purification of senses. In other words, the yoga principles of meditation are required as long as one is not situated in pure devotional service. The mind is used to purify the senses, but when the senses are purified by meditation, there's no need to sit in a particular place and try to meditate upon the form of the Lord. One becomes so habituated that he automatically engages in the personal service of the Lord. When the mind forcibly is engaged upon the form of the Lord, this is called Nirbija Yoga or lifeless yoga. For the yogi does not automatically engage in the personal service of the Lord, but when he is constantly thinking of the Lord, that is called Sabbija Yoga or living yoga. One has to be promoted to the platform of living yoga. One should engage in the service of the Lord 24 hours a day, as confirmed in the Brahma Samhita. The stage of Premanjana Charita can be attained by developing complete love. When one's love for the Supreme Personality Godhead in devotional service is fully developed, one always sees the Lord even without artificially meditating on his form. His vision is divine because he has no other engagement. It at this stage of spiritual realization, it is not necessary to engage the mind artificially, since the meditation recommended in the lower stages is a means to come to the platform of devotional service. Those already engaged in the transcendental, loving service of the Lord are above such meditation. The stage of perfection is called Krishna consciousness. Okay, so now text number 35 says, when the mind is thus completely freed from all material contamination and detached from material objectives, it is just like the flame of a lamp. At that time, the mind is actually dovetailed with that of the Supreme Lord and is experienced as one with him because it is freed from the interactive flow of the material qualities. Yeah, no more material thoughts, only the thoughts of Krishna. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. In the material world, the activities of the mind are acceptance and rejection. As long as the mind is in material consciousness, it must be forcibly trained to accept meditation on the Supreme Personality Godhead. But when one is actually elevated to loving Supreme Lord, the mind is automatically absorbed in the thought of the Lord. In such a position, a yogi has desires. The yogi has no other thought than to serve the Lord. This dovetailing of the mind with the desires of the Supreme Personality Godhead is called nirvana, or making the mind one with the Supreme Lord. The best example of nirvana is cited in Bhagavad Gita. In the beginning, the mind of Arjuna deviated from Krishna's. Krishna wanted Arjuna to fight, but Arjuna did not want to. So there was disagreement. But after hearing Bhagavad Gita from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Arjuna dovetailed his mind with Krishna's desire. This is called oneness. This oneness, however, did not cause Arjuna and Krishna to lose their individualities. The Mayavadi philosophers cannot understand this. They think that oneness necessitates loss of individuality. Actually, however, we find in Bhagavad Gita that individuality is not lost. When the mind is completely purified in love of Godhead, the mind becomes the mind of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The mind at that time does not act separately, nor does it act without inspiration. to fulfill the desire of the Lord. The individual liberated soul has no other activity. Prati nivita guna pravaha. In the conditioned state, the mind is always engaged in activity impelled by the three modes of the material world. But in the transcendental stage, the material modes cannot disturb the mind of the devotee. The devotee has no other concern than in satisfying the desires of the Lord. That is the highest stage of perfection, called nirvana or nirvana mukti. At this stage, the mind becomes completely free from material desire. Yatarchi. Archi means flame. When a lamp is broken or the oil is finished, we see that the flame of the lamp goes out. But according to scientific understanding, the flame is not extinguished, it is conserved. This is conservation of energy. Similarly, when the mind stops functioning on the material platform, it is conserved in the activities of the Supreme Lord. The Mayavadi philosophers' conception of cessation of the functions of the mind is explained here. Cessation of the mental functions means cessation of activities conducted under the influence of the three modes of material nature. Well, yeah, one does not become a silent meditator, let's put it like that, in simple language. Uh, that's why it says when the mind stops functioning on the material platform, it is conserved in the activities of the Supreme Lord. That means it stops thinking in terms of sense gratification because now it is completely engaged in thinking and engaging in the service of the Lord. The Mayavadi philosopher's conception of cessation of the functions of the mind is explained here. Cessation of the mental functions means cessation of activities conducted under the influence of the three modes of uh, material nature. Mm. Let me take a better look at this verse. This verse says, when the mind is thus completely freed from all material contamination and detached from material objectives, it is just like the flame of a lamp. At that time, the mind is actually dovetailed with that of the Supreme Lord and is experienced as one with him because it is freed from the interactive flow of the material desires. Okay, so that means that one is detached from material objectives and no longer having any material contamination. Okay, but that doesn't mean that the mind is empty. Uh, it says here, at that time, the mind is actually dovetailed with that of the Supreme Lord. In other words, whatever the Supreme Lord wants, the devotee wants also. So, so the devotee's mind is completely focused on pleasing Krishna with active uh, devotional service. That's why it says, at that time, the mind is actually dovetailed with that of the Supreme Lord and is experienced as one with him. In other words, the devotee now has only the desires to please the Lord according to the way the Lord wants to be pleased. not speculating in the way of speculating. And therefore it says, uh, at that time, the mind is actually dovetailed with that of the Supreme Lord, as experienced as one with Him, one in purpose, in other words. One has the same purpose as the Lord and is experienced as one with Him because it is freed from the interactive flow of the material qualities, which means free from all, let's say, disturbing or distractive thoughts of sense gratification. And that's why it says uh, uh, that at that time the mind is actually dovetailed, in other words, completely connected to that with that of the Supreme Lord. In other words, one has to, whatever the Supreme Lord desires, the Lord devotee desires. With that of the Supreme, and is experienced as one in purpose, one in, let's say, communion with the Lord, because it is freed from the interactive flow of the material qualities. In other words, his mind is no longer disturbed by, I want this, I don't want that. It's no longer what I want, it's what Krishna wants. So, therefore, whatever Krishna wants, that's what the devotee wants. There's no more question of what I want. The devotee is completely dedicated to pleasing the Lord through devotional service, active devotional service. Okay, and let's read this purport a little bit more. In the material world, the activities of mind are acceptance and rejection. As long as the mind is in material consciousness, it must be forcibly trained to accept meditation on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Well, it says forcibly. But when one is actually elevated to loving the Supreme Lord, the mind is automatically absorbed in thought of the Lord. In such a position, a yogi has no other thought than to serve the Lord. This dovetailing means connecting to, this dovetailing of the mind with the desires of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is called nirvana, or making the mind one with the Supreme Lord. So one with the Supreme Lord means that you have the same, you have the desire, the unique desire of pleasing the Lord. It doesn't mean that you become the Lord, but your desires are uniquely for serving the Lord with love and devotion. The best example of nirvana is cited in Bhagavad Gita. In the beginning, the mind of Arjuna deviated from Krishna. That means that he didn't want to fight. Krishna's asking him, "You please fight." And Arjuna threw down his bow and arrow and said that he's not going to fight. Krishna wanted Arjuna to fight, but Arjuna did not want to. So there was disagreement. But after hearing Bhagavad Gita from the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Arjuna dovetailed his mind, in other words, connected, or in other words, agreed to do what Krishna asked. Arjuna dovetailed his mind with Krishna's desire. This is called oneness. Oneness in purpose, in other words. Whatever the Lord wants, that's what the devotee wants. This is called oneness. This oneness, however, did not cause Arjuna and Krishna to lose their individualities. The Mayavadi philosophers cannot understand this. They think that oneness necessitates loss of individualities. Actually, however, we find in Bhagavad Gita that individuality is not lost when the mind is completely purified in love of God. The mind becomes the mind of the Supreme Personality of God. In other words, whatever Krishna wants, that's what the devotee wants. So there's oneness, but one does not lose individuality. One's mind, senses, and desires are all focused on pleasing the Lord by active devotional service. The mind at that time does not act separately, nor does it act without inspiration to fulfill the desire of the Lord. Yeah, one is inspired. One is naturally now attracted to the Lord. There's no force or uh, let's say artificial or mechanical activity. One is acting with full consciousness and full love for the Lord. So there's nothing, let's say, uh, there's no contamination in the purpose of the devotees acting in service of the Lord. It's not that he is doing it, with a grudge or with, let's say, uh, dissatisfaction. Is fully satisfied by engaging only in the devotional service of the Lord with love and devotion. So then it says, when the mind is completely purified in love of God, the mind becomes the mind of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That's a very nice statement. The mind at that time does not act separately, nor does it act without inspiration to fulfill the desire of the Lord. The individual liberated soul has no other activity. Pratinivita guna pravaha. In the conditioned state of the mind, in the conditioned state, the mind is always engaged in activity impelled by the three modes of the material world. So that's in a conditioned state. The devotee is under the control of the three modes of material nature. But in the transcendental stage, the material modes cannot disturb the mind of the devotee. The devotee has no other concern than to satisfy the desires of the Lord. That is the highest stage of perfection, called nirvana or nirvana mukti. At this stage, the mind becomes completely free from material desires. Okay, well, that doesn't mean that the mind becomes a white slate. Uh, uh, the mind, there's still desires, but now they're purified desires to please the Lord, not to be meditating on nothingness or uh, in a vacuum, but one's mind now is completely dovetailed with the desires of the Lord. Yatarchi. Archi means flame. When a lamp is broken or the oil is finished, we see that the flame of the lamp goes out. But according to scientific understanding, the flame is not extinguished, it is conserved. This is conservation of energy. Similarly, when the mind stops functioning on the material platform, it is conserved in the activities of the Supreme Lord. The Mayavadi philosopher's conception of cessation of the functions of the mind is explained here. Cessation of the mental functions means cessation of activities conducted under the influence of the three modes of nature. But that doesn't mean that the mind stops functioning. It just means that it's not functioning with the desire for sense gratification, but now it's functioning under the, let's say, with the desire of pleasing the Lord. So rather than pleasing oneself, now the preoccupation of the mind is how to please the Lord. So the Mayavadi philosopher's conception of cessation or finishing of the functions of the mind is explained here. Cessation of the mental functions means cessation of activities conducted under the influence of the three modes of material nature. Okay, that is not necessarily bad. One stops acting under the influence of three modes of material nature, but that is not the perfection of spiritual life. So let's see what it says now. Thus, situated in the highest transcendental stage, the mind ceases from all material reaction and becomes situated in its own glory, transcendental to all material conceptions of happiness and distress. At that time, the yogi realized the truth of his relationship with the Supreme Personality Godhead. He discovers that pleasure and pain, as well as their interactions, which he attributed to his own self, are actually due to the false ego, which is a product of ignorance. Okay, now that's a very important verse. It is it is explaining what real, let's say, nirvana is, real connection to the Lord. Second, okay. Forgetfulness of one's relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a product of ignorance. By yoga practice, one can eradicate this ignorance of thinking oneself independent of the Supreme Lord. One's actual relationship is eternally that of love. The living entity is meant to render transcendental loving service to the Lord. Forgetfulness of that sweet relationship is called ignorance. And in ignorance, one is impelled by the three material modes of nature to think himself the enjoyer. When the devotee's mind is purified, and he understands that his mind has to be dovetailed with the desires of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he has attained the perfectional transcendental stage, which is beyond the perception of material distress and happiness. As long as one acts on his own account, he is subject to all the material perceptions of so-called happiness and distress. Actually, there is no happiness, just as there is no happiness in any of the activities of a madman. So, in material activities, the mental concoctions of happiness and distress are false. Actually, everything is distress when the mind is dovetailed to act according to the desire of the Lord. One has attained the transcendental stage. The desire to lord it over material nature is the cause of ignorance. And when that desire is completely extinguished, and the desires are dovetailed with those of the Lord Krishna, one has reached the perfectional state. So again, using this word dovetailed means connected to. Upal abda, paratma kashtaha. Upalabda means realization. Realization necessarily indicates individuality. in the perfectional, liberated stage, there is actual realization. Nirvritya means that the living entity keeps his individuality. Oneness means that he realizes happiness in the happiness of the Supreme Lord. That's a very nice statement. Oneness means that he realizes his happiness in the happiness of the Supreme Lord. In the Supreme Lord, there is nothing but happiness. Anandamaya Vyasat. The Lord is by nature full of nothing but happiness. Anandamaya Vyasat. The Lord is by nature full of transcendental happiness. In the liberated stage, oneness with the Supreme Lord means that one has no realization other than happiness, but the individual still exists. Otherwise, the word upalabdha, indicating individual realization of transcendental happiness, would not have been used. Okay, so one is uh, one is individually experiencing transcendental happiness in the by meditating and acting on behalf of the Lord, by meditating on the Lord and then also proactively engaged in the devotional service of the Lord. So when it says in the liberated state, oneness with the Supreme Lord means that one has no realization other than happiness. But the individual still exists. Otherwise, this word upalabdha, indicating individual realization of transcendental happiness, would not have been used. So, but what has happened is now one is completely connected to pleasing the desires of the Lord rather than pleasing his own desires for sense gratification or fame or power, whatever. The devotee's only desire is to please the Lord under the uh, instruction of the bona fide spiritual master or masters. So that means that oneness is not the oneness of the Maya body by merging into the body of the Lord, for example. The oneness of the devotee is always agreeing with the desire of the Lord and proactively acting to please the Lord by his activities. Okay. Then it says here, text 37, because he has achieved his real identity, the perfectly realized soul has no conception of how the material body is moving or acting, just as an intoxicated person cannot understand whether or not he has clothing on his body. That's a nice verse. Yeah. So he's acting, let's say, naturally, without any ulterior motive. So he's one with the Lord because whatever the Lord wants, that's what he wants. So he doesn't have to have second thoughts about it. Is this right? Is this wrong? Should I do this? Should I not do this? Uh, that means that he has achieved his real identity. The perfectly realized soul has no conception of how the material body is moving or acting. Just as an intoxicated person cannot understand whether or not he has clothing on his body. Purport. This stage of life is explained by Rupa Goswami in his Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. A person whose mind is completely dovetailed with the desire of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and who engages 100% in the service of the Lord forgets his material bodily demands. Well, what are the bodily demands? Eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. So now the Lord is not, the devotee is not concerned by eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. He's concerned by engaging in those activities that please the Lord. It doesn't mean that he stops eating. Yeah, he'll continue to eat, but only prasadam. And he'll eat reverently. That's a very important word, reverently, with devotion and love for the Lord, with great, let's say, satisfaction from the mercy of the Lord, who's giving him simple good stuff like milk and sweetener, like sugar or something that is sweet naturally, and always eating things that are in sattva guna, the mode of goodness, and always well wishing others and doing beneficial things to help uh, people make spiritual advancement. So, because he has achieved his real identity, the perfectly realized soul has no conception of how the material body is moving or acting, just as an intoxicated person cannot understand whether or not he has clothing on his body. So the devotee is so much immersed in serving the Lord that he has uh, no conception of any selfish desires. He only has these pure desires to please the Lord. This stage of life is explained by Rupa Goswami in the Bhakti Rasamrita Tender. A person whose mind is completely dovetailed with the desire of the Supreme Personality of Godhead and who engages 100% in the service of the Lord forgets his material bodily demand. Okay. So he no longer wants to have uh, illicit sex, gambling, meat eating, intoxication, and any other type of sense gratification. But he does engage his senses in pleasing the senses of the Lord rather than engaging in the activity of pleasing his own senses. He engages his senses in the activity of the Lord's devotional service. That's it's a difficult material. It's a difficult stage to achieve because most people act for their own sense gratification. But to be only and uniquely engaged in pleasing the senses of Krishna is what's being talked about here. Krishna also has senses, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, etc. So if we dovetail our senses into the desire to please the senses of Krishna, then one is liberated. And that's why it says here, the body of such a liberated yogi, along with the senses, is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of God. And it functions until its destined activities are finished. The liberated devotee, being awake to his constitutional position and thus situated in samadhi, the highest perfectional stage of yoga, does not accept the byproducts of the material body as his own. Thus, he considers his bodily activities to be like the activities of a body in a dream. Well, the gopis, they also say that We do not believe that our body belongs to us. We believe that our body and our mind actually belongs only to Krishna. Therefore, if we do any meditation, we meditate on transcendental service of the Lord and not uh, desire to enjoy sense gratification in a selfish way. So however, we do not deny the senses. We engage the senses in Krishna's service. So therefore, that is real yoga. Yoga means connecting to God. So real yoga is when we connect to God through devotional service, not simply by uh, meditation, silent meditation. By silent meditation, there is some connection with God if one is thinking about God. But in active meditation, one is acting to please the Lord. And that's the real position of the devotee. He wants to please the Lord through his actions of devotional service. So now there is oneness because the Lord is seeking the pleasing activities of the devotee. That way they're connected together in happiness and joyful engagement in devotional service. The Lord also aspires to uh, engage in devotional service with the devotee. So the devotee is trying to please the Lord, and the Lord is trying to please the devotee. Uh, so and the devotees and Krishna is always trying to seek an opportunity to please the devotee, and the devotee is always avoiding uh, the the devotee doesn't want Krishna to please him. He wants uniquely to please the Lord. So there's a competition going on between the Lord and the devotee. Okay, so he says in this purport to text 38, the following questions may be posed. As long as the liberated soul is in contact with the body, why don't the bodily activities affect him? Doesn't he actually become contaminated by the action and reaction of material activities? In answer to such questions, this verse explains that the material body of a liberated soul is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is not acting due to the living force of the living entity. It is simply acting as a reaction to past activities. Even after being switched off, an electric fan moves for some time. That movement is not due to the electric current, but is a continuation of the last moment. That movement is not due to the electric current, but is a continuation of the last movement. Similarly, although a liberated soul appears to be acting just like an ordinary man, his actions are to be accepted as the continuation of past activities. In a dream, one may see himself expanded through many bodies, but when awake, he can understand that those bodies were all false. Similarly, although a liberated soul has the byproducts of the body, children, wife, house, etc., he does not identify himself with those bodily expansions. He knows that they are all products of the material dream. The gross body is made of the gross elements of matter, and the subtle body is made of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. If one can accept the subtle body of a dream as false and not identify himself with that body, then certainly an awake person need not identify with the gross body, as one who is awake has no connection with the activities of the body in a dream. An awakened, liberated soul has no connection with the activities of the present body. In other words, because he is acquainted with his constitutional position, he never accepts the bodily concept of life. Yeah. So, what is the bodily concept of life? I am this body. What is the real constitutional position? I am the eternal servant of the Lord. I am not this body. What is the first thing we learn in Krishna consciousness? I am not this body. uh, that's what Prabhupada is teaching us. I am not this body. Then what am I? But I use this body in the service of Krishna because he is the ultimate proprietor of everything, including the body of the Lord, of the devotee. So when the devotee stops thinking I, me, and mine, and starts thinking that everything belongs to Krishna, including my body, that's how the gopis think. They think that their body it actually belongs to Krishna, and they use their body only in the satisfaction of Krishna. Most people think I am this body, and I'm using this body for my own sense gratification. Whereas the gopis think my body actually is not my body. It belongs to Krishna, and therefore my only happiness is to please Krishna with this body and mind and senses. In other words, the only thoughts of the gopis is to please Krishna with all their, let's say, given assets, such as the body and mind, etc. Everything is focused on pleasing Krishna. But in the case of the gopis, it is not silent meditation. They are actively engaged in trying to please the Lord in every possible way. That's why they chant for the Lord, they dance for the Lord, they glorify the Lord. Everything they do is connected to Krishna. Okay. Okay, let's see. So there's a very interesting statement here. It says, the following questions may be posed. As long as the liberated soul is in contact with the body, why don't the bodily activities affect him? Doesn't he actually become contaminated by the action and reaction of material activities? In answers to such questions, this verse explains that the material body of the liberated soul is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of God. It is not acting due to the living force of the living entity. It is simply acting as a reaction to past activities. Even after switching off an electric fan, even after switching off, comma, an electric fan moves for some time. That movement is not due to the electric current, but it is a continuation of the last movement. Similarly, although a liberated soul appears to be acting just like an ordinary man, his actions are to be accepted as the continuation of past activities. In a dream, one may see himself expanded through many bodies, but when awake, he can understand that those bodies were all false. Similarly, although the liberated soul has the byproducts of the body, children, wife, house, etc., he does not identify himself with those bodily expansions. He knows that they are all products of the material dream. The gross body is made of the gross elements of matter, and the subtle body is made of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. If one can accept the subtle body of a dream as false and not identify oneself with that body, then certainly an awake person need not identify with the gross body. As one who is awake has no connection with the activities of the body in a dream, an awakened, liberated soul has no connection with the activities of the present body. In other words, because he is acquainted with his constitutional position, he never accepts the bodily concept of life. Yeah, that doesn't mean he is, let's say, in a inactive state. He's proactively engaged, but uniquely in the service of the Lord. The bodily concept is being engaged in trying to please the desires, the material desires, which are always focused on pleasing the senses of the body that one has. But in reality, the real position is to use the senses of the body and the mind and everything in the service of the Lord. That purifies a person. If we work only to please our own senses, then we become entangled in the process of, let's say, material desires, where we forget Krishna and engage only in selfish activities for sense gratification. This forgetfulness of Krishna, well, in order to be a devotee, you have to remember Krishna. In order to be a sense gratifier, you have to forget Krishna. So when a person forgets Krishna, then they do all kinds of things for sense gratification. But when a devotee remembers his real purpose in life, that is to use everything, material or spiritual, in the service of the Lord, and not try to be the Lord, but rather be the servant of the servant of the servant of the Lord. Okay, so any questions? So here's a very nice statement. It says, the body, this is the verse 28. 38, I'm sorry, verse 38. It says, the body of such a liberated yogi, along with the sense, is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and it functions until its destined activities are finished. The liberated devotee, being awake to his constitutional position and thus situated in samadhi, the highest perfectional stage of yoga, does not accept the byproducts of the material body as his own. Thus, he considers his bodily activities to be like the activities of a body in a dream. Okay, so what does that mean exactly? Uh, like the activities of a body in a dream. So it says the following question may be posed. As long as the liberated soul is in contact with the body, why don't the bodily activities affect him? That's a good question. Doesn't he actually become contaminated by the action and reaction of material activities? In answer to such questions, this verse explained that the material body of a liberated soul is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of God. It is not acting due to the living force of the living entity. It is simply acting as a reaction of past activities. Even after being switched off, an electric fan moves for some time. That movement is not due to the electric current, but is a continuation of the last movement. Similarly, although a liberated soul appears to be acting just like an ordinary man, his actions are to be considered as the continuation of past activity. In a dream, one may see himself expanded through many bodies, but when awake, he can understand that those bodies were all false. Similarly, although a liberated soul has, by the products of the body, children, wife, uh, house, etc., he does not identify himself with those bodily expansions. He knows that they are all products of the material dream. The gross body is made of the gross elements of matter, and the subtle body is made of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. If one can accept the subtle body of a dream as false and not identify himself with that body, then certainly an awake person need not identify with the gross body, as one who is awake has no connection with the activities of the body in the dream, and awakened, liberated soul has no connection with the activities of the present body. In other words, because he is acquainted with his constitutional position, he never accepts the bodily concept of life. Okay, so what does he do? He accepts the spiritual activities of, uh, of pleasing the Lord with his body, mind, and senses. He's no longer using the body, the mind, and the senses in sense gratification for his own material satisfaction. Now he's dovetailing everything, all his attributes, and trying to please the Lord without any selfish motive. Okay, I think we're stop right there. Are there any questions or comments?
So, a person of this pure consciousness, can they still function in the current world, Maharaj, in that case?
Yeah, Prabhupada was functioning. How was he functioning? He was functioning in teaching the Krishna conscious.
Hmm.
He's writing books, traveling, and establishing temples, and maintaining temples, and inspiring devotees to distribute books. And thus they did distribute tons and tons of books, and they're still doing it. So his point was to use everything in service of the Lord. And that's what we're trying to do today also, trying to dovetail all our activities into the service of the Lord. Therefore, nothing is mine, everything belongs to Krishna. And Krishna says that he is the proprietor of all activities of the devotee. So we should not act independently. We should be interested in acquiring the knowledge by which we can please the Lord or please Krishna every day of our life by engaging in proactive devotional activities. And that will please everyone, actually. Uh, when we go out on Sankirtan and distribute nice prasadam, it pleases people. But at the same time, they get a connection with Krishna. So that is what we do. We're always trying to dovetail everything into Krishna consciousness and help people get a taste of transcendental activities and thoughts. Haribol, are there any questions anybody would like to ask? Go ahead.
Yes, Vidya. You Hare Krishna. Any other question? Any questions online? So in a way, Maharaj, these verses are all they're talking about how to meditate on the form of the Lord. Of course, again, Prabhupada says that chanting, we have taken hearing and chanting. But is the are the instructions relevant for us when we go to the temple and see the form of the Lord? This is the way to meditate on the form of the Lord. Like all this, like each verse is focused on looking at from the feet of the Lord to the face of the Lord, eventually focus on the smile of the Lord. And so at least we're in the practice stage. So is that the instruction for us that when we go to the temple, we should try to see the Lord in this particular way to develop attachment to the form of the Lord? Or is that not something that's relevant for our parampara? I know because most of these words talk about the yogi.
A yogi means a devotee.
Mhm. So these verses are relevant for us also as devotees, right? And in a
Yes.
sense, like how we to think about it in a practical manner. Is this are these the verses that we can memorize or think about and then use them as we go and in front of the Lord?
Well, okay, the verse 38 says, the body of such a liberated yogi, along with the senses, is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of God, and it functions until its destined activities are finished. In other words, when we become a devotee, the Lord takes, let's say, uh, charge of the body of the devotee, and it functions until its destined activities are finished. The liberated devotee, being awake to his constitutional position and thus situated in samadhi, the highest professional stage of yoga, does not accept the byproducts of the material body as his own. Thus, he considers his bodily activities to be like the activities of a body in a dream. So, uh, the devotee's, let's say, responsibility towards family is such that he knows that's a temporary thing, but he performs his duty, but without attachment. So, uh, the okay, so let's give the example of a vacation. Does a devotee take a vacation? Actually, no. But a devotee can go on parikrama, let's say in India. Is that a vacation? No, because she's still engaged in devotional service. But if he goes to, sit on the beach and get a suntan, that in let's say in India, that is not actually being engaged in devotional service. But the devotee will go to India to engage in parikram and hearing lectures by advanced devotees and engaging in devotional service in the holy dham. Like I remember one time uh, I was in Vrindavan, and one devotee who was serving Prabhupada, he asked me to uh, um, oh yeah, he asked me to go and fetch 2 buckets of water. So they have this rod. There's a rod, and it's connected with rope to 2 buckets, and you have to sort of put it on your
Balance it.
back, neck, yeah, and carry it. So he gave me that and said, "Go and get water for Prabhupada. He needs it for his bath." It was in the evening, actually. And I said, "Okay." So I went, and you have to. Uh, there was no faucet of water. There was a well, so you had to there, and there was a bucket on this, with a rope. So you have to throw a bucket and the rope into the well, and then you have to bring the water up and the bucket up with water in it, right? So I did that, and I got the 2 buckets of water, and you have this rod that you know connected to the rope with ropes to the 2 buckets, and now you sort of put that on your shoulders, and you walk, to I had to walk to Prabhupada's room, not inside of it, but near it. And there was the secondary room where the servant of Prabhupada was. And I brought the 2 buckets of water. This was in the evening time, actually. And the devotee thanked me and he said, "Wait a minute." And then he took the water into Prabhupada so he could take his bath. Then he came back and he gave me a uh, a, uh, um, a bottle. It's not it's like not exactly a bottle, but a jar that was originally, I think the jar had some type of uh, food or something in it originally, but now it was clean and dry, and it had a lid on it also, a screw on top, and he gives me this jar, and he said, "This is the dust of the lotus feet of Srila Prabhupada from his room." In other words, he swept the room of Srila Prabhupada, collected the dust from his lotus feet, and put it in this jar, and he gave it to me.
Mm.
And so he said, Prabhupada, this is the dust from the lotus feet of Srila Prabhupada. After I finished, sweeping his room, he said. And that was my, let's say, transcendental reward
Mm.
for
Mm.
fetching water for Prabhupada from the well. So I was really overwhelmed by that. Yeah. Now, if some mundane person is given, the dust of the from the feet of a pure devotee or from Prabhupada, for example, they wouldn't know what to do with it. They wouldn't see it. significance.
Do you still have it?
No, I don't have
Mm.
it. Unfortunately, I don't have it. Yeah. So, but I thought that was like, very precious, gift. And and that was like, my reward for fetching water for Prabhupada. I had to go to the well. I had this rod uh, with two buckets, tied to it, and I had to take each bucket take one bucket off from the rods, and then tie it to a rope that I threw down into the well, and then brought the water up, and then tied it uh, to the rod, and then when both of them were full and connected to the rod, I had to pick it up, with my two hands, and put it like on my shoulder and carry it to Prabhupada's room. So these were transcendental activities in the Holy Dham in Vrindavan, and I got the opportunity to serve Prabhupada like that. Okay, so are there any questions?
Mm.
Hare Krishna Guru Maharaj.
Haribol.
One quick question, Maharaj.
Yeah.
Based on today lecture, uh, everything we need to surrender to Krishna, and Krishna will actually guide us. See, especially for me and for us, like we are in material world, we got connected little late, and we are connected after, yeah, with the materialistic world. We caught between. Now, for example, we need to work, and even in work also sometimes that may be not. We are very happy 100% because the companies work under their own directions. If we don't work, they will also will. There is always constant fear of throwing you out, and all the things that competition is created like that. That environment for kind of what I stuck, what we are not able to come out at the same time. Without work we cannot able to pay the bills, and we cannot stay in Samamish. It's very very expensive. What's your message, Maharaj? Because when you go for work, there will be too much things goes on, and you may not have some time to think constantly Krishna at that time.
Well, the proof that you have been thinking of Krishna at that time is that you give some of the money that you've made to the temple. That means you were thinking of Krishna. If you don't give anything to the temple, then there's no proof that you were thinking of Krishna. You were only thinking of yourself and your family. So there has to be some sacrifice. And the devotees are generous. They do give, some part of their, income to the Lord. So that means you all the time you were working, you were thinking of Krishna. You made a decision that some part of your income will go to the Lord.
But how to
Whereas,
think, even in that materialistic world also, the
yeah,
lot of instructions will come, which is coming from Krishna, which is actually which we need to follow, because some instructions are we cannot talk, just follow whether you like it or not, because that's how corporate world works.
no, if you don't like something, like if you don't like to serve Krishna, you're not going to sacrifice anything to Krishna. But if you have uh, love and devotion for Prabhupada and Krishna, you will sacrifice for the Lord. You see. Look at Jesus Christ. He had to sacrifice uh, for on the uh, desire of his Father, and Christ sort of questioned that and was a little hesitant because Krishna was asking him to be crucified, but he finally decided to do it. And look what happened. People are still talking about Jesus Christ and worshiping him and chanting his glories. Why? Because he completely surrendered to the will of the Lord. So we have the chance or the opportunity to completely surrender to the desires of the Lord through the spiritual master and engage in activities of devotional service. But our devotional service is not as severe as the one Jesus had. He had to sacrifice his life and his body. We sacrifice our life and our body, but not in the extremes way as Jesus. We use our body and our senses and mind in serving the Lord, right? And we support the temple, and we do things that are called sacrifices. So that means that we are genuine devotees. We're willing to sacrifice things that we have and time that we have for serving the Lord. In this way, uh, let's see, so it says here, the body of a liberated yogi, along with the senses, is taken charge of by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and it functions until its destined activities are finished. The liberated devotee, being awake to his constitutional position, and thus situated in samadhi, the highest perfectional stage of yoga, does not accept the byproducts of the material body as his own. Thus, he considers his bodily activities to be like the activities of a body in a dream. Well, the gopis also, they say, the body that we have does not belong to us. It belongs to Krishna. And we use it only in the service of the Lord, to please the Lord. So in the same way, the devotee does not say, this is my body, I own this body, and it's this type of, my body is French or my body is American, etc. The devotee has come to the conclusion that my body belongs to the Lord, and I should only use it in the service of the Lord, just like the gopis. They also said, my body belongs to Krishna, and whatever way I can please the Lord with my body and my mind and everything that I have, that is my real purpose in life. So everything depends on the concept of proprietorship. If I am convinced that my body belongs to Krishna, then I'll only engage in devotional activities to please Krishna. If I think that this is my body, and therefore I'll use it to satisfy my senses, and going on vacations and eating and sleeping and all that, but for the satisfaction of the senses, the selfish use of the senses and body for sense gratification, that is not a devotee. But a devotee is one who uses all his attributes, mind, senses, everything, in the service of Krishna. So it looks like whatever the materialist is doing and whatever the devotee is doing, it looks like the same thing, but it's not. The devotee is doing everything for Krishna, and the materialist is doing everything for himself and his family. So, yeah, the devotee has a family also. The devotee also works. The devotee also earns money, but he uses part of that money to engage in Krishna consciousness, and with the aim gradually of totally using everything in Krishna's service. So if you have a family and children, you have 50%, let's say, concentration on your family and 50% concentration on Krishna consciousness. But by continuing to work like that, eventually your children grow up and they become independent. And now it's just you and your wife, and you and your wife go on pilgrimages. And now you're free to go on pilgrimages and to holy dhams and even stay there and live a very simple life. And eventually, the man can even take sannyas. And now he's not even connected anymore to his wife. And the wife also, she lives like a sannyasi in a holy dham, in a holy place. So she's still loyal to her husband. The husband's still loyal to his wife, but they're no longer in proximity. The devotee gentleman uh, takes a vow of renunciation, and he doesn't really see his wife anymore. And the wife has a vow of renunciation also by living in a holy place and engaging always in devotional service. So there are different stages of, let's say, uh, service to the Lord. And in the final stages, one cuts off all attachment to house, home, wife, or husband, and is completely dedicated to serving Krishna. So the wife is also a sannyasi in the sense that she doesn't act anymore for sense gratification, but it does everything to please the spiritual master and Krishna. And the husband also becomes a sannyasi, and or let's say the husband and wife never separate. Okay, but now they both together cooperatively engage in devotional service to please spiritual master and Krishna. So there's different ways of doing things. Like some people might decide not to separate, but to work together to serve Krishna for the rest of their life. And some people might want to separate, and the husband leaves the wife under the protection of her adult children and completely lives very, very renounced life alone. He can be in the company of devotees, but he's no longer connected to the wife. And the wife is no longer connected to the husband. So there's different ways of surrendering completely to the Lord. It doesn't mean that, oh, you never left the association of your wife. Uh, as long as both you and your wife continued uh, acting more and more, you know, proactively in the service of the Lord, it's on basically the same level as leaving each other and acting in the service of the Lord. But it's recommended. Uh, I mean, you can remain, let's say, together right up to death, but it's better to follow the example of Prabhupada. And Prabhupada, he did take care of his body, his children, his wife. And when he did leave and take sannyas, he still had uh, some of the money that he was making by preaching. He left it to his family, so they would, he left something to his family. He didn't just uh, forget them, but he was not associating with them anymore. And by the way, Prabhupada actually didn't really like his wife. She was always, uh, she would do things like drink coffee and things like that. She wasn't sinful. She was a good Hindu. But she had her own mind, let's say, you know. But still, he never, rejected her, and he didn't reject his family either. So he did leave money for them after when he was uh, leaving his body. And he had a lot of affection for his kids, but especially for one of his kids, he had a lot of affection for him. Not all of his kids became devotees. I mean, they might have been good Hindus, but they did not, engage, proactively in devotional service. But one of his sons was very proactive, and Prabhupada liked him very, very much, and always was trying to help him. Okay, all glories to Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Chant Hare Krishna and be happy. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Guru Maharaj. Thank you for your guidance.
Haribo, Haribo. Chant Hare Krishna and be happy. Shower.